We have received a number of questions from our participants, and I encourage everyone to feel free to continue to engage. We'll try to get through, or we've got plenty of time, so I think we can have a really robust discussion here. This first one might be, well, it might be appropriate. So this is having to do with facilities writ large. And a attendee from Kenya notes that one of the problems that they've experienced with facilities, presumably things like the Kenya Pooled Water Fund and others, is that the investment rules, the ticket size, creditworthiness of the borrowing entities, et cetera, are not, they're misaligned with the realities of the local market. Do the funds, do the facilities that you're proposing here address that in any way?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that. And I think this really speaks to the importance of the local design. And in a place like Kenya would be, I think, a good candidate for a facility, given that it has numerous urban water utilities in cities and towns throughout the country. And I think one thing to keep in mind, you know, what we've presented and what we've been thinking about are really the broader conceptual ideas for a financing facility. But the next step is for countries that are interested in this is really to dive deep into the particular characteristics of those utilities to tailor something that will work in that context. And it doesn't have to be, even in one country, a one-size-fits-all solution. You know, it could be that a facility in Kenya would provide guarantees to those utilities that already are creditworthy. But then, you know, other utilities in Kenya that are in an operating deficit and maybe aren't creditworthy at all, you know, perhaps there would be a different arrangement, a combination of grants and lower interest loans. So right now we haven't explored those details, but I think that highlights the importance of this next step in tailoring the facilities to specific country contexts. And I think you're on mute, Chris. You might be
thank you. I
the
just
next
muted
question.
myself. Thank you.
Yeah.
You think I haven't done one of these before? Are there good examples, good case studies? I know you put up a list of examples where these have been implemented. Are there currently such liquidity facilities operating in today's COVID-19 circumstances? Do we have good examples up and running right now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's another great question. I know that some things are under works. I don't know what has been implemented yet, but I've heard of work ongoing, a multi-sector facility in the LAC region, looking at not only water, but also, I believe, energy, and perhaps other sectors as well. And so I think it's an ongoing process, but definitely I think there is some work on the ground already in terms of at least translating these bigger conceptual concepts into the actual design of the facility itself.
And for some of our participants that might not know the acronym, I'm guessing that LAC is Latin America and Caribbean.
Yep. Yes, that's correct. Thank you.
Thanks. What about the option of bundling electricity and water liquidity facilities together? Your target customers are likely to be the same, and they're all critical services with similar tariff structures. Is that something that Castalia has looked at, or are there examples of that out there?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, I believe so. I believe this LAC is one example of that. And I think it could apply elsewhere too. I think one important difference between the two sectors is, you know, as Lisa alluded to, water is a more local business. So many countries might have multiple water utilities, whereas, you know, one national electric utility, you know, is more common, plus the economics of the two sectors, you know, the electricity sector may also be, you know, unbundled and possibly more complex in terms of which entities should the facilities be targeting. But I do think that's definitely one consideration to keep in mind, because there could be economies of scale to combining the two sectors in certain places.
Moving into the NRW PBC space, one of the issues with NRW, we've seen this in other structures as well, is around the idea of a accurate baseline. Many utilities or municipalities, their water balance is not wholly accurate, and it's hard to get a handle on those. And how do you ensure in setting up one of these structures that you can achieve such an objective baseline that's transparent, that provides the incentives for both parties, and that there's not an advantage or disadvantage in them? I know locally there was the case study in city of Johannesburg, which tried something similar, not a PPP approach, but something similar. It was very hard to isolate system inflows.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question, because baselines have historically been really tricky, really time consuming, because for non-revenue water reduction to get the information you need for a good baseline, you really need to dig underground, to install meters, to check out the pipes, to do all of that. And once you start to do that work, and in some respects you're actually starting the work of non-revenue water reduction itself. So the various models that we've been exploring aim to do this, aim to actually not do the baseline before the PBC, but do it within the PBC itself. So that does lend itself to kind of a multi-phase PBC, because you can't set all of the detailed, you may not be able to set all of the detailed remuneration mechanisms up at the front before that baseline is established, but rather the first phase of the contract, the contractor would establish that baseline, and definitely you'd want an independent third party to check the work the contractor is doing that can help get around some of these differing incentives between the contractor and the utility, and then move to, in the second phase, the actual NRW reduction after those metrics and remuneration mechanisms have been established. And there's other contract types as well where you could consider setting, for example, an increasing block payment structure in advance, and having various contractors bid on how much NRW reduction do they think they could do at these unit prices. These are innovative models. They haven't all been implemented yet, but I do think there are options to overcome these challenges.
I've had two questions received covering both of the options that you've presented, and the question speaks to both of them, or the questions speak to both of them. In one of the things that we're addressing here is trying to respond to a pandemic, which hopefully will eventually come to an end. Maybe a 2-year time horizon. Hopefully sooner, but let's say it's 2 years, and we're facing cash constraints today. And so the question is, are these mechanisms realistic answers to immediate cash concerns? Is it more appropriate looking at a 2 to 3 year midterm approach, or are we talking about a longer term resilience mechanism for whatever the next crisis might be?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, great question. I think it's a mix of all of those. So urgency is obviously really important, because many utilities, it was probably back in March or April when the the initial shock in terms of reduced cash collections materialized, and now we're on June, and some of these utilities, if it continues at these levels, how much longer can they go with the cash reserves they have? That's a really big question and a really big concern. And I think on the financing facility side, it's important. I saw a question too about just how quick can you estimate the amount of money you may need. And what's really great is, with tools like the one the World Bank has developed to estimate that scale of support, you can actually figure that out pretty quickly, even for utilities that don't have their own financial model right now. And I think too that concept of estimating, definitely, don't go into that situation thinking that you're going to get it exactly right. It's more of an estimate to begin with. There may be a base case, a low scenario, a high scenario, starting with the emergency funds. And then, like in the graph Lisa showed, this could really be a multi-step process where first there's a disbursement for emergency funds, and then there are later disbursements if targets are met, kind of thinking about long-term sector resiliency. And I guess on moving quickly, it is true that facilities can take time to set up, but I mean, here as well, working with existing institutions, working with existing mechanisms that are already set up in a particular country, that's going to be really important to get this moving quickly. So if a utility or if a country already has some kind of mechanism to provide, grants or operating expenses or a facility, that can be kind of utilized and built upon to get this going quickly. And on the NRW PBC side, it's something I would say start now. In terms of the actual monetary benefits, it might be a couple of years down the line, but start now to set that up. These two options, you don't need to pick one or the other. They can be done in parallel, and they can be done with other options as well.
Joe, I'd like to pull your experience in here as a director for utility companies and the like. And I know you've been working closely with the utilities through this crisis. In your experience, are utilities, both UK and through Africa, are they receptive to this kind of innovative financing? Do they have the bandwidth to address this? And do you see that there's an uptake or a willingness to expend time, energy, resources in these innovations to address their short-term or medium-term financial constraints?
It's very variable. I know some very successful PBCs, and for instance, South Africa has had quite a number. But other parts of Africa seem to be a bit more resistant, and I'm not quite sure why. Certainly where they have been implemented, generally they've been successful, at least the one. I'd like to think the ones I've been involved with have been. But I do take the point that baselining can be tricky, and you would need to think about that quite carefully, because in an awful lot of African countries, the actual network is very poorly documented, very poorly measured, a lack of input meters, let alone any meters within the network. So a lot of work has to be done to get something that can be agreed by both parties. And I was interested that, Shannon said you need an independent party to really verify the baseline. But I do wonder whether part of it is just that it's never been proposed, and African municipalities and water utilities have seen that performance-based contracts, you know, they might appear to be very commercial, giving some of the benefit to a contractor rather than, you know, they want to take all the benefits from NRW because they need all the money they can get. So there may be those feelings, but actually I think it's a really positive way to progress. And I think it's great that Rock Blue is helping disseminate these options, because I think maybe one or two other water related not-for-profit organizations are slightly more suspicious of these commercial contracts and so may not be raising them. And certainly, as, if you like, a technical consultant, it's sometimes difficult for me to go in and propose a commercial response to a problem. And I don't want to be seen to be promoting any one company. You know, there are a number, and it was great that, you know, Shannon, I think it was Shannon or Lisa, he included the list of ones who do work in this area, all of whom have done some excellent work. So I think there are a number of reasons behind it. I don't think there's any reason why it couldn't work. Getting the baseline can be tricky, as you know, someone quite rightly presented, but with the right shape of contract, then that can be overcome. And then generally, I think it works really well. I would say the other thing is that with these contracts, you need to make very sure that there is a transfer of knowledge element, and some have been better at that than others, because the last thing you want is to have a really good job, NRW comes down, end of the contract's reached, contractor leaves, because unless people know what to do who are left behind, the NRW will just go back up again, and all that good work will be undone.
Thanks, Joe. Following on from that conversation, if Shannon or Lisa could address the idea of whether PBCs or NRW PBCs are appropriate or can be used in utilities that are generally underperforming, i.e. they've got low network coverage, high commercial losses, etc. Is that appropriate, or is it only in a more sophisticated environment?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, that's a great question. I think, you know, actually places that have higher losses, commercial losses, physical losses, you know, higher non-revenue water, an NRW PBC could actually be more viable, because you know, if your NRW is in the range of 70%, 60%, most likely pretty relatively low cost measures could be implemented to reduce that. Because the thing is, you know, the more you reduce NRW, the more expensive it gets per unit, simply because you're going to start with the lower cost measures first and then move towards the higher cost measures. So in some places it would be appropriate. Definitely I do see related questions related to the intermittency of supply and the challenge that, you know, once you start, you know, producing more water and increasing the hours of supply and increasing the pressure in the pipes, NRW will also increase. And that definitely is a challenge in those situations. And it could be that the, you know, the PBC is still going to be valuable, but now you may be looking at the benefits in terms of, you know, moving more customers to 24/7 supply. Perhaps that is the metric the contractor is measured against, instead of you know, volume per day of loss reduction. So being creative in those situations and really defining, what is the metric here that it's most applicable in this context.
Okay, that's great. It also addresses another question that has come up, the idea of, like you say, if you're successful in NRW, and or let's say you're successful in increasing volume supplies in your system, you've secured additional bulk services, your NRW levels will increase with the additional pressure. Conversely to that, again, if you reduce, if in one section of your pipe you've reduced NRW losses downstream, you're going to see an increase. So what you're saying is just getting that baseline right, or better yet, changing your indicator.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, I'm just making sure. I'm trying to get everybody's question, and everybody's got the same question around a different nuance. So I appreciate helping me think through that. Going back up to the liquidity question, a concern with that model is your example model, and I realize it's only intended to be illustrative, but you've assumed a V-shaped recovery. Many of our utilities are taking severe, likely long-term impacts in their performance, and you're going to see I don't know what the opposite of a V-shape is, but how long is the timeline of the disbursements? What would be repayment periods? How would we address something with a longer trailing leg of recovery?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, great question. And definitely, the graph was very stylized. So yeah, it would be excellent if the recovery could happen just as quick as the downfall. But, unfortunately, in many cases, we're probably already past that period, since the pandemic has been going on for a few months. So it could be, kind of a steeper drop, and then a more, a less steep curve in terms of, getting back to covering the costs. But I do think it will kind of depend on how quickly these facilities or related measures can be set up, and how they're structured. But it's true. I mean, I do think it's very possible the kind of longer you wait to provide the emergency response, you might actually need more money for the emergency response, because as you're waiting to get money, okay, assets are deteriorating, and when those aren't properly maintained, the backlog of maintenance and other issues could cause larger issues down the line.
One of our participants pointed out a better term for me, calling it a U-shaped recovery, and I can see that makes sense to me. We've had a very abrupt downward trajectory. If the pandemic stays with us for a time, you can imagine that there will be a sustained period of lower performance, followed hopefully by a strong recovery once we're past this. So certainly our facilities and our planning needs to take that into account. Our friend Aldo Baetti comments that the reforms that you envision in the liquidity model usually require some form of CapEx investment to drive that performance improvement. But currently, most utilities that are not recovering costs currently aren't going to achieve substantial improvements on their own that would be necessary to receive those additional disbursements. And at the end of the day, how are they ever going to repay the financing, unless it's on a grant basis, if these reforms don't achieve recovery levels?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. Yeah, I think so on the first part of the question, I think one way to structure it would be in terms of structuring the milestones that would result in additional disbursements, tying those where possible to efforts that are already ongoing in the sector. And the first milestone, could be something like implement the new water policy, or, adopt a new governance structure. And that wouldn't be something totally brand new, but likely in many of these countries and for many of these utilities, maybe that's an effort that they've already been working on for many years. And this could be, the advantage of getting additional funds under the facility could be a good, sometimes these things get held up in government or held up in other ways. The promise of these additional funds could be a good way to lock in those reforms, so that they do happen. And things like that, since they're already well set up, wouldn't require too much additional capex. Down the line, it is true that other performance metrics may require more capex, but perhaps that could be covered with some of the loan money provided in some of the earlier disbursements. On the question of, how would these utilities pay back loans, it must be grants. There, I think a really interesting topic to explore is all of the details of how we would structure these loans to make them work for both parties. Because at the end of the day, grants would be great, but concessional finance and grants are pretty limited, and the facility or the government might not want to provide grants to the utilities if that means the national government has to pay it back to the financiers at the end of the day. So things to consider are grace periods, in terms of allowing, maybe it's a much longer grace period to allow time to get back to that level. Maybe it's, loans at very low rates, just to really start to instill that, on the utility side, that habit of repaying loans. So I think there's various ways to structure it that could make it work. Providing grants to everyone would be awesome, but probably wouldn't be enough money to go around if we did that everywhere.
Thanks, Shannon. There was a question around, going back to the PBCs, and your illustrative model again demonstrated a potential 6-year payback period. And there's a concern, and this probably reflects many of the utilities working in our Southern Africa countries, where the lending markets aren't willing to take on long-term risk. And there's a concern that a relatively short 6-year payback period is out of line with the financial investors that are currently out there looking for shorter payback periods. Do you believe those are popular? Those are possible? And in testing your model, have you looked at that at countries in that circumstance?
Yep. Yeah, definitely. I'd say most people that we've spoken to, the range they're looking for is somewhere from 3 years to 10 years. So I definitely agree. You definitely have certain investors, contractors that wouldn't be comfortable with the 6 years. And what I hadn't mentioned in presenting the slide, but what is a viable option is, blended finance, an opportunity to have partial private finance, and you can adjust the financial metrics as such so that the private party gets paid back first, or gets 80% of the initial payback, and that can help reduce that party's payback period in those situations where the overall project payback period is a bit longer than what people are looking for. We've talked to Yeah, we've talked to people all over, a lot in the Caribbean, a few in Southeast Asia, a few in Africa, but probably less represented than the Americas and Southeast Asia.
Now I'd like to actually call on one of our participants today. Greg from City Taps has suggested that he's got some approaches that could address some of the issues that come up in your potential facilities. I'm going to see if I can give him permission to talk. And Greg, are you there?
I'm here. Hi.
So Greg, you've suggested that you've got a solution for the escrow account.
Yes. So thank you, first of all, and thank you for this really very good series of seminars in which I've learned quite a bit. So CityTap solution is a pay-as-you-go and smart water metering system that uses mobile payments. So the payments are fully digital, which is important for reassuring the financial party that the payments can be traced. Because the payments are done by mobile payment and because they're done on a pay-as-you-go basis, on a prepaid basis, they can be routed directly to an account that can be either a dedicated account, an escrow account, a reserved account, whatever you want to call it, that can serve as the intermediary step that was described in one of the slides as providing a guarantee to the financial investor. The interesting part about this is that unlike a case where the money is being collected in cash or whether it's being collected on a postpaid basis, because it's collected both in a prepaid basis and and through a digital payment system, it's completely transparent. And so the investor and the utility can agree in real time as to what the financial flows are and decide at what pace they should be they should be split between the utility and the investor. Another thing that's very important is that our solution allows for the individualized repayment of arrears, which is to say that if, let's say, somebody owes you, 100x, 100,000 shillings, let's say, in Kenya of debt, and they're never going to come up with that money, but they can pay you 100 shillings for 1,000 days, or they can pay you 200 shillings for 500 days, or you can do the math. The point is that that money is recoverable through individualized daily micropayments. You can recover that money, and that money becomes the basis for the affordability of the solutions that we propose. But also it becomes the possibility for you to clean up, meaning the water utility, to clean up your balance sheet, which means that when you go to the bank next time and ask them for a 50 million shilling loan, they're not going to say as a first response, why don't you collect this 100 million that you've got outstanding, which is what they usually tell water utilities today. Instead, you're going to be able to say, look, we've made headways on this 100 million. It's now 75. We have a plan for recovering the next, 25 million in the next year, another 25 million in the following year. We're good for the money. We are credible. We are worthy of your trust as a financial institution because our clients are paying for us and they're paying for our services through this completely transparent pay-as-you-go solution. So the advantages go several ways in lowering the risks for the financial investor, lowering the counterparty risk that they perceive. For those of you who were here last time in the last lecture about creditworthiness, it's a way to increase the creditworthiness of the utility for a specific project. And it's a way to make these NRW PBC projects potentially more viable because the financial flows are more transparent and because the data is available. It's also a smart metering solution. So all the information you need to reduce your NRW at the physical level is available as well. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Greg. Interesting input to this. I can definitely see how it ties into building the surety of cash flow for repayment and the like. So absolutely. Thanks for that input. I've been saving this question for the panel, because it's both related to what we're talking about, but also much broader. And I do want to bring it out because many people are struggling with this right now, is the challenge for the utilities in these developing countries. Right now, government has competing demands for finance, for human resources, for their attention. And what are the options to ensure continuity of supply of water, or driving it as a government priority? What messaging do we need out there? I realize this takes a step out for all of us, but while we've got Joe, Shannon, and Lisa on the line, I want to put it out to each of them to think through what that messaging needs to be for our partner utilities and municipalities. Let's go in kind of order. Let's go, Joe, if you've got any thoughts on that, or I'll let you each kind of decide how to raise your hands.
I think the critical thing to get across is the importance of water in fighting the pandemic. I tried to get across in my presentation that people go on about PPE, but actually the most important thing that people can do to minimize their risk is wash their hands with soap and water. It's more effective than hand sanitizer. Research has shown that. And yet, providing the water just doesn't seem to be in a lot of government and local municipality minds. They just sort of take it for granted. And so it's really getting that message across. And that needs to be done by the leaders in water utilities. If a country has an association either of professional people or of utilities or anything like that, they should be getting that message out, that it's far more important than anything else. Yes, there will be some things that contribute to getting the water there, like energy supplies, like fuel supplies, like some materials. But actually, it's the water that's important. Hospitals won't be able to function if they don't have water. Hospitals can function with most other things. I've seen hospitals function with temporary lighting and other energy supplies, but they have to have water. And so therefore, why wouldn't a government prioritize water? It's the most important sort of weapon in the armory of fighting COVID.
Shannon, Lisa, any thoughts on this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely agree with Joe, 100%. And I think just to add to that, I think what's really important, I think, is the communication at multiple levels. So it's from the utilities to their ministry, the Ministry of Water or whoever oversees them, and similarly, and perhaps even more importantly, from the Ministry of Water to the Ministry of Finance. Because when you're thinking about getting money, the Ministry of Finance does kind of control the purse in terms of funds coming through from larger donors, the IMF, etc. And the Ministry of Finance probably won't have the Ministry of Water and water supply at the top of its mind. So without that kind of active lobbying, really, by the Ministry of Water to mention all of these points that Joe just went through and to really make a case for it, I don't think water utilities can just wait and expect the money to come from them. I think that active effort, especially with the Ministry of Finance, is really critical to put water on the table as the most important issue.
And Lisa, I wanted to give you some input here. but I don't want to put you on the spot.
Thanks so much for letting me go last after two incredibly smart people. Yeah, I completely agree with what Joe and Shannon have said. I think the most important thing, unfortunately, is just going to need to be utilities advocating for themselves. I think a lot of governments have physically seen the duress that hospitals and the health system are under because they see beds overridden, they see the mortalities, all the numbers like that. But the impact on water utilities isn't quite as visibly evident. So it's just something that really they're going to have to vocalize and share. Like Joe said, the executive management really needs to make that apparent to decision makers and, as Shannon mentioned, the ministries that are responsible for both securing the finance and ensuring their long-term resiliency and sustainability.
Thanks to all of you for that feedback. I want to wrap that up today. I really want to thank all of our participants for joining us today. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you will take the time to fill out the survey at the when you log off of Zoom, and we really hope that you will join us for our next in the lecture series, which will be announced shortly. You should receive an email to the address that you used to register today, and also please check out rockblue.org to learn more about our mission. Finally, thank you to all of our panelists. Lisa and Shannon, thank you for getting up early and joining us from the East Coast of the U.S. Joe, as always, thanks for your contribution here. Congrats again on the award. That's fantastic, and we really do appreciate you taking your time out from a busy day. With that, I would like to just check with Peter if he's still available, if he wants to close off today.
Chris, thank you very much for the presentation, the learning event. To Joe, Lisa, Shannon, and everyone who's still on the call, we really appreciate it. You know, these are critical times. And so you rolling up your sleeve, I know everyone is so busy, including those that are on the call, very busy because of the pandemic, dealing with the pandemic. So we really appreciate all that you've done. And I'd like to give a shout out, I think it was Lisa who started this off by saying this, shout out to all the public utilities, public officials that are still there, still in the front line, still providing water despite the new challenges, and then also all those that are supporting them. You are on the front line, and as I think Joe said, water is PPE. She's actually quoting Matt Damon when she said water is PPE. And so that translates to the those that work at the utilities and work with the utilities. So thank you very much for all that. If there's anybody out there who needs additional assistance with the utilities, for sure contact Rock Blue, and we'll do our best. This is a critical time. We're all rolling up our sleeves, working together on this. Chris, thank you for facilitating, and everyone have a great rest of your week. And I wish you the best of health to you and your family and your colleagues.
Thanks everyone. Good night.